What does God speak about? Some say God only ever speaks about positive things. But if the Holy Spirit speaks as the continuing voice of Jesus, then we might expect God to speak to us about the areas of our lives we may not want to talk about. That is, God may speak to warn us and expose our wrongdoing, those dark areas of our hearts that we want to hide. God is the ultimate truth teller, but his purpose is always to protect the innocent and to set the guilty free. Hi, and welcome to the God Conversations podcast. My name is Tanya Harris, and I'm a pastor, practical theologian, author, and founding director of God Conversations, a ministry that equips you to recognize and respond to God's voice. Welcome to the show, everyone. And, today's episode is a rather heavy one, I have to say. It all began when I was having a conversation actually with a pastor in New Zealand earlier in the year, in 2024. He was a man who had decades of experience in ministry, but tragically had also been privy to some God conversations that he'd rather not have heard. Along with his wife, Karen, for 20 years he led Gateway Church in Hamilton, New Zealand. And during this season, they watched God restore a church that was broken and bruised by the sexual failure of leadership. And it became a thriving congregation of over 1,200 people. The man is a gifted teacher whose ministry has been appreciated throughout New Zealand and in many nations. And he is a man who I believe has a lot of wisdom and comes from a real place of integrity, and the perfect person to talk about what is a somewhat difficult topic. So welcome to the show, Pastor Don Barry.
Hi, Tanya. Nice to be with you.
It's wonderful to be with you, Don. I had such a great time at your church, along with Pastor Chris Jones. And, one of the things I noticed, I visit many different churches, but your church just had this strong feeling of being very safe. And I realized that came from a place of great integrity. And I think that you are very qualified to speak about this particular topic. So perhaps you can introduce yourself to the God Conversations audience from all over the world. We've picked up a lot of new subscribers recently from the UK as I've been over there. But perhaps you can introduce yourself. How did you come to be doing what you are doing now?
I've been in ministry nearly 5 decades now, Tanya. I was raised in a non-Christian home. I became a Catholic in my teen years. Long story I won't go into, but my fiancée at that time, Karen, and I got well and truly converted in the midst of what we called the Jesus Revolution, the charismatic era. And after a few years of school teaching, I felt a real call to ministry. So 1977, I went full-time. I spent 7 years in the first church that I was involved with, a little Pentecostal church in my hometown. And then I came up into the Waikato region of New Zealand to a beautiful town called Cambridge, where Karen and I pastored for 11 and a half years. And then through some quite dramatic circumstances, we came to the city of Hamilton. It was our intention to stay 2 years, and it's been 30 years this month, and a long journey that we've been pastoring what is now Gateway Church here in Hamilton.
And a beautiful church at that, Don. And such faithfulness in ministry over so many years, I think, really marks who you are and what you've done. We are all about God Conversations. You're a man who knows how to hear God's voice. Perhaps in your journey, do you have a God conversation that you could share that maybe shaped your life that you could tell us about?
Oh, a very significant one, actually, from our time in Cambridge, Tanya. We were in Cambridge 11 and a half years, absolutely loved the town, loved the church, had no intention of moving. But over a series of months, a number of things happened, all of which, God was significantly involved in, that got us uprooted and moved from Cambridge. It really started with a sense of being deeply unsettled, which is really unusual for me. I'm a very settled person. I think Karen might have called me boring in those days, but I went through a long season of being very unsettled. So I called a friend of mine and said, my goodness, I don't quite know what's happening to me. Any insight? And quite weirdly for me, he said, Don, God's not thinking, or do you think God might be planning to move you? And my first response was kind of, get behind me, Satan. I'm not planning on moving from here. We love it. But he gave me an illustration, actually, which hit home because my wife Karen was a gardener. She loved gardening. And he said to me, Don, when you move a larger tree or a larger bush, you can't just dig it up and move it because the shock will kill it. He said what you do is you dig around it, move it, backwards and forwards, then come back to it. And he said, I just kind of wonder if maybe God's unsettling you. Well, my initial response was, yeah, interesting, but I don't think so. But within the next month, Tanya, I had at least 4 invitations to pastor other churches.
Wow.
Now, that had never happened to me before. So that really alerted me. So Karen and I set ourselves to, after conversations, we thought we'd better pray, and we did. But at the end of that period, we weren't really any clearer, except that I went to our denominational conference that year, and after a ministry time, I was standing quietly. The meeting had finished, and people were going in all directions, and I was kind of pondering, Lord, is this you? And somebody tapped me on my right shoulder. I turned around and I looked at this guy, and I didn't know him, and he said to me, Don, you don't know me, but I really feel like the Lord wanted me to tell you, you're supposed to move from Cambridge, you're going to go to a city. And he turned around and walked away. And I was kind of shocked, and I was looking at this guy thinking, this is kind of like the Lone Ranger. There must be a silver bullet somewhere around here, this masked man. And he went away, and while I was watching him, I got a tap on my left shoulder, and it was another guy, and he said, hey, Don, this is going to sound really weird, but I feel to tell you you're supposed to leave Cambridge and you're going to go to a city.
Wow.
He did not hear the first guy because, everyone was talking, and he just quietly said it to me. A week later, I was in another meeting with an American speaker, and he looked at me and he said, hey, are you thinking about leaving your church? And I said, I'm really trying hard not to. But he said, no. He said, God's in this. And he said, you're supposed to leave your church and you're going to go to a city.
Oh, my gosh. So, Don, you got it in triplicate.
Yeah, I did. And I probably needed it in triplicate because, to be fair, Tanya, I'm probably not the brightest bulb in the chandelier, and I really didn't want to go from Cambridge. And we grieved because we loved the church. The really funny thing about that is it was so clear that we were supposed to go and we were going to go to a city, but we had no idea what city, and God didn't say. And he kept us kind of on the hook in a way. We checked a couple of cities out, and then a missions organisation came to us and said, hey, would you be interested in coming to Singapore? We'd really like you to head up a Bible college as a sort of a finishing school for missionaries going out on the field. Well, Karen and I have always loved Singapore, and the thought that we might go there was, wow, we'd love to, And so they said, look, it's going to take us 2 years to put this in place. We know that you're leaving Cambridge. What will you do for the 2 years? Well, a church nearby they were one of the churches that had asked us, would we be interested in pastoring them? And I said no, basically without even thinking about it, to be fair, looking back, because they were such a different church, so different in their DNA and culture, and I knew that it would be a massive shift for us to come. But they came back to us and said, hey, would you be interested in coming and taking our Bible college? And so I said to them, look, we've got a 2-year hiatus before we go to Singapore. If you're prepared to have us for 2 years, we'll do it. So they said, yep, we'd love to have you. So we moved to Hamilton, to what was then an Assemblies of God church. And for 2 years...
And long story short, you ended up staying for longer than 2 years.
Well, 30 years later. Really.
Do you know what I like about your story is that you see the beauty of the clarity when God speaks in the way that God does, but then you still go on this journey that's quite human, isn't it? You get this interplay.
Absolutely.
And God can get the message through very clearly, as he did for you, but then he still engages our human self in the process.
Well, it was a real journey of faith. We left, sort of Cambridge, knowing that we were supposed to go, having set it up ready to go, but not knowing where we were going.
And
that was a real journey of faith for us.
You came to Gateway Church. Now, this is the church I visited at the beginning of the year, and a beautiful, strong church. Had a wonderful time there. Incredible facility and team that you've got. But it's not how it started for you. We're talking on this episode about God conversations that warn, expose sin and wrongdoing. And I'm guessing this is a topic you never wanted to be equipped to speak on. Perhaps you can tell us how this started for you.
Yeah, sure. I'd been in the church a couple of months, Tanya. As I said, Karen and I had taken the Bible college, so we were involved in the Bible college, but not so much the church. I mean, obviously we attended the church, but I wasn't on the leadership team or anything like that. In fact, we deliberately asked not to be considered in that sense. I think the first hint I got that probably something wasn't as I anticipated was, I remember coming home and talking to Karen and saying, all of these people are coming to talk to me, and it's all about sexual brokenness, and I've never experienced so many people confessing sexual brokenness ever before. And I guess I put it down to the fact that it was a much bigger church than I'd come from. Cambridge was probably 150 to 200 people. This church was well over 1,000 and probably was one of the flagship churches of our movement. But I thought, golly, there's something wrong. About 3-4 months into it, I had a dream. And in the dream, we lived just out of town, or out of the city, and in the dream I was driving into work, and I came around a corner, and there was a sort of a bank on the side of the road that had a culvert going into the bank, and a lot of men in white suits who looked like they were cleaning up a chemical spill were going into the culvert and raking out onto the roadside all of this incredibly unclean, horrible muck. And I remember driving by and going, oh, that's horrible. Fancy exposing that to everybody driving by. Well, I woke up and I guess I'd had enough experiences with dreams to take notice. And it registered with me. I went back to sleep and I dreamt the same dream, exactly like a video replay. And that had never happened to me previously.
No, that's never happened to me.
Well, it's never happened to me since either. I woke thinking, oh my goodness, something's happening here. And I immediately thought of Joseph when he said to Pharaoh, the dream has been doubled because it's going to happen quickly. So I was very aware that God seemed to be saying that he was going to expose something that was unclean. And to be fair, Tanya, I was probably saying, for the first day, 24 hours, Lord, is there something in me? Is there something wrong? I'm not aware of something, but I know I don't know my own heart. Are you trying to tell me something, And
can I just say that's a really wise thing to do when you have a dream is to check yourself first before you start applying it to something else. I think that's really
absolutely,
really
and
nice.
As I say, I wasn't aware of anything, but like Paul said, you don't know your own heart, and you're waiting for the Lord's directions, in terms of his comment on your attitudes or behaviour. But within probably 48 hours, I was in my office. I had a knock on the door, and a staff member came in. She was pale, and she said, oh my God, Don, I've just had a woman in my office and she's confessed to an affair with the guy who had planted the church, was the superintendent of our movement, was on, internationally known speaker. And Tanya, the only way I can explain this is a series of dominoes that just went one after another, because within 2 weeks we had 5 other women, all unconnected. They hadn't been talking to each other, but all just impressed or pressured by the Lord to confess. And so at least 5 had come in over this very short period saying, I had an affair with him. This happened to me. And again, in the midst of that, Tanya, I had another dream. And in the dream, there was a very old, dilapidated house up on a hill. And in my dream, in very short steps, I was really up close to it. And I could see this window that was peppered with borer holes. And then suddenly a disembodied hand with a flame came and went up round the windowsill, and as it was going by the holes, these little insects and things were coming out of the hole, pressured by the heat. And I thought, oh my goodness, what's this? Well, the next day, another staff member came in, sat down and said, Don, we have just had another woman come and confess. This stuff is coming out of the woodwork. And it was like, oh, wow.
Literally.
Wow. Yeah. And we knew it was the Lord, and I needed to know it was the Lord, because when I took that information to our executive, I think they sort of viewed me, Tanya, like the cat that brought in the night kill and laid it on the couch, It was like, oh, this is really inconvenient, And a couple of voices said to me, this is the devil's attempt to destroy a good man's ministry. You should try and keep this covered. You shouldn't do anything with this. We're going to quieten this down. To add insult to injury or vinegar to the wound, whichever you like, in the midst of all that, another man came to me and said, hey, Don, since you are dealing with this was a man in our congregation. He said, since you're dealing with this, you also need to know, and he named an internationally known figure who had been to the church and said while he was here, he molested my boys. And it was like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? So again, I went to the leaders of the movement, and by this stage, I really was the cat that had brought in the night kill. And one of them said to me, do you think you're a ghostbuster or something? What are you trying to do? Destroy people's lives and ministries? And I just said, look, if we're going to learn one thing from the history of our church, we cannot hide this. We have to address it. Well, we went through probably a period of about 18 months, 2 years, going backwards and forwards. Both men acknowledged what they had done. The first, they stood down for a 12-month period. The second, they came back to us and said, look, he's old and he's got the first signs of dementia, so we're just going to retire him and say that he's retired because he's sick. At that point in time, Tanya, I dug my toes in and said, no, you can't do that. I will not allow you to do that. If we're going to learn one thing from history, it is that you cannot hide these things. We've got to be open. We've got to be vulnerable. The response was, this is not good for our movement. It won't, we really need to keep this undercover. It's not good for the movement. I remember saying to them, the spirit of Caiaphas is alive and well. That's what he said about Jesus. We've got to get rid of this man for the sake of the movement and for the temple.
Don,
anyway, we carried on.
Imagine, I have a million questions to ask you about this whole scenario, because I think that we can learn a lot from it, both from the heart of God and at what is appropriate in our response. But we're just going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back and explore some of the insights that have come out of these God conversations that expose and warn.
Did you know that God's most common way of speaking in biblical history is in dreams and visions? God still speaks in this creative and powerful way today, but we don't always recognize it. But not every dream is from God. So how do we know when it is? And how do we understand the strange symbolism and imagery that appears in our dream visions? The God Dreams online course answers these questions and more. It includes 7 streamable videos, digital study guide and bonus resources. Join with a small group from your church or study on your own. Be equipped to recognize God's voice in dreams and visions. As Jesus said, we can all recognize his voice and follow. Available now at godconversations.com/courses.
Welcome back to God Conversations. We are talking to Don Barry, who is a pastor, a long-standing pastor over in beautiful New Zealand, been a pastor of one church for 30 years, but been in ministry much longer, but has also seen and heard some things about the work of God in people's lives to expose sin. Don, that's just a horrific story. My first thought is, God gave you 2 prophetic dreams that he was cleaning out, he was exposing. You have to expose to clean, don't you? Why do you think God spoke those things to you?
Oh, good question, Tanya. I don't know. To be fair, I was, not the senior pastor of the church at the time. I would like to think that he knew that I was probably bloody-minded enough and stubborn enough to not just let it lie and to not be willing. I mean, I'd come out of the Catholic Church, Tanya, and it's not news to anybody that the Catholic Church has struggled massively with immorality among the priests, have tried to hide it, move priests around, and it's been probably one of the most drastically wrong decisions that the Catholic Church has made in many a decade. I often say there are rotten apples in any barrel. Whether it's gymnastic coaches or swimming coaches or you name it, you'll find rotten apples in the barrel. The problem is not rotten apples in the barrel, Tanya. The problem is what leadership does with rotten apples, and the answer is not to put the lid on and hope they'll go away or try and cover them, because you can't do it that way.
I find it interesting, Don, that God spoke to you about it, but then people came and spoke to you about it too. Perhaps they detected that there was safety and integrity in your heart and that you were able to walk things through in a way that was honouring to God. I think because we know that sin is in all of our hearts, and that the only way for God to transform our hearts and set us free has to be exposing, doesn't it? It all starts with exposing and conviction and truth-telling. You cannot receive grace without first confronting truth, as ugly as it may be. But perhaps you were the one that God could trust to walk through this muck and mire. Perhaps God was using you as one of those white men in suits. No, one of those men in white suits.
Yeah. It didn't feel like I had a suit on for a lot of that, Tanya. It was pretty rugged for a bit there, especially when the key people in the movement were saying you're doing the wrong thing. You're doing the devil's work of condemnation, and so I think one of the reasons the Lord was so specific to me is I needed to know it was Him, because I could have been shaped or influenced or silenced, and thought maybe I am, but it felt so strongly that it was the Lord, and the way the dominoes fell, it had His touch on it. And although, as you say, although it was messy, and I always remember, Tanya, many years ago seeing an advert or hearing about an advert from a dentist who advertised himself as Dr. Painless. And the reason he was Dr. Painless was, it turned out, was that he didn't dig out the decay, he just filled over the top of it. So there was no drilling, except for the problem that several months down the line, the teeth had to be extracted because the decay had been covered. And although we hate the drilling procedure, without removing the decay, there is no chance of health. You're putting a Band-Aid on cancer. And so while it's difficult, while it's painful, nobody wants to go through that. That's the essence of repentance. It's the confrontation with the broken parts of our lives. And as you say, we're all broken. And when the Lord puts His finger, it's not to condemn, it's to deliver. But it does require sometimes the drilling process, and as difficult as that is, and as painful as it is, we have to go through it.
So you've seen God expose sin at a leadership at a corporate scale, on a corporate scale. Perhaps if we can drill back into a micro level, because I think the work of the Spirit, so we talk about the Spirit speaks as the continuing voice of Jesus. And we know that Jesus was very concerned about the state of our hearts. And certainly with the disciples, he was always pointing to the heart. So the Spirit speaks likewise. And when the Spirit speaks to us, we shouldn't be surprised that the Spirit uncovers sin, exposes things, gives us a mirror. First of all, perhaps in our own lives, and then at a wider level. How do we respond to that? Perhaps first of all, as an individual, if God's putting his finger on something in my heart or exposing some addiction or some wrong behavior, and I have the courage to go and confess it or it gets exposed, how, as brothers and sisters in the journey of God, how do we respond to that? What do we do?
Well, I think if you're the one confessing, you find somebody safe, somebody that you can trust, somebody that you feel will handle you well, and if necessary, go and unburden yourself to them. If you're at the other on the other side of the table, Galatians says Galatians 6, I think it is, talks about the fact that you restore people with a degree of humility, knowing that it well could be your turn next week. You don't do it from a place of superiority or, Pharisaic or self-righteousness. We're broken and we get to help one another in the process. So it's kind of that process of give and take, Tanya. One of the things I think, on that micro level that we so often don't associate with God's voice is our conscience. And, I know, when you get saved, your conscience can be, it's battered and bruised and it needs restoration. But the longer we walk with Jesus, I think the more our conscience and the voice of the Holy Spirit close ranks. And so Paul says in Romans chapter 9, my conscience bearing witness with me. And there is that joining of the Spirit's voice with your conscience. And so you'll be involved in a conversation sometimes, and you'll say something that's probably inappropriate. And immediately there's a sense, I should not have said that. And the conscience draws your attention to something that should not have been said, or an attitude that shouldn't have been manifest in the conversation. And it's important what you do with that. You can either say, oh, well, that they'll understand, or they said that, or that the person deserved that actually. I think it's really important in those settings that you find yourself a quiet place and just say, Lord, I shouldn't have said that, should I? And in those moments, you can sometimes there's a requirement or the sense that, I need to go and put that right. And there have been times, Tanya, where I've gone and said, hey, in that conversation where I said thus and so, I should not have said that, and I'm really sorry. Other times it might just be, please don't do that again, Yeah. I often, one of the things that I often talk to our congregation about is, Karen passed away in January, but one of the things that I often would do with Karen is, if I sensed that there was something between us or something, and I didn't know, maybe I didn't know what it was, but I felt like, oh, golly, I think maybe I've offended Karen. I would go to her and say, hey, hon, are we okay? Are we okay? And sometimes she'd say, yeah, sure, fine, why? Other times she might say, fine. And I knew it wasn't fine and we needed to dig into it, I do the same with the Lord, and I think it's probably a paraphrase of Psalm 139, where David said, search me, O God. I often say to our congregation, the old prayer of examine, the nighttime prayer that the ancients used to pray, Lord, are we okay? How's the day been? Are we okay? And listen for his commentary on attitudes, ambitions, motivations, words that have been spoken. Just keeping really short accounts, Tanya. And
I think that's so true, Don. And just to get good at that, it's like a reflex you can practice, isn't it? And when other people do it to us, it's easier for us to do it with them. So we can create a culture where we keep short accounts. I love that. I'm thinking what happened in your story as those things were exposed. God exposes things for a reason. He doesn't do it just to air our dirty laundry, doesn't do it to humiliate or to take us down. God's purpose is always redemptive, to set us free. Did you see that process in the situation that you found yourself in the church? How did it end up for you going through that?
It was very difficult in the church. The senior leader at that time essentially had a breakdown and decided that he was going to step away from the church. That was the point in time where the leaders came and said, "Hey, would you and Karen take the church?" And I said to them, "Oh, we're only here for 2 years," and we've by that stage a year had gone by, and I said, "I'll look after the church for a year while you find some other pastor." And but it was so I said yes, temporarily, and then just after that, only weeks after that, the missions organisation that were calling us to Singapore called me and said, "Hey Don, the college is not going to happen. We can't get it up and running. We don't have the funding. So I'm really sorry, but Singapore's off the agenda." And I remember saying, "You're not half as sorry as I am." The church went through a terrible time, Tanya. It went from probably 1,200 to bottom out at about, I suspect, around 3. There were those who were angry with us because enough hadn't been done to get these men out of ministry. They felt we'd been too light on them. The other half of the church thought we were terrible and had destroyed these men of God, and it swirled for months. So we went through a very difficult time. However, God was incredible, has been incredible, and has, we're a normal church, Tanya. We're good, bad, and ugly, depending on what day you ask me. But mostly it's a healthy church now. It's normal, whereas before the waters felt very muddy and very swirly, and I wrote my story. And I called it Water Under the Bridge and a whole lot of other stuff too, which was taken from a Dylan line. I'm a bit of a Bob Dylan fan, but it felt like that, Ultimately, yes, I have seen the redemptive grace of God in the life of the church. It has been wonderful, but it didn't happen overnight. Kind of reminds me of that, here at it will happen, it might just take a little bit of time. It's not going to happen overnight. But God has been incredibly faithful.
The path of integrity is a tough one, isn't it?
Well, it can be. I guess we live in a culture, Tanya, where we look for immediate rewards, And I often say to people, you can get immediate rewards by doing steroids, but the ultimate end of steroids is probably cancer or some kind of tumour. You can't keep doing that. And you want to build body mass, you do the hard work, you lift iron, you pump iron, and it takes a while, and some days it's really painful and you're wondering if this is really working. But I think that's why it's a journey. There's just that faithfulness in the journey. Often people say to me, "How you doing?" And my favourite answer, Tanya, is, "Yeah, I'm plodding on." And I think it was William Carey once who said, "I'm not a genius, I plod, but it's amazing how far you can go if you keep plodding." And I think the life of integrity is a bit like that. If you're looking for instantaneous rewards, then there are other ways to get it. You can cut corners, you can be ethically, a bit shadowy, and you can make gains by doing it fast. But there's an old saying, when you want to go fast, go slow. And I just think the way of integrity, while it might not give you immediate rewards, is the way that you have to walk. And it's interesting, the end of Psalm 78, it says of David that he walked and he led Israel in the integrity of his heart and the skillfulness of his hands. And I think sometimes in the church we've elevated the skillfulness of hands over the integrity of heart. I think the order is significant, and I think the second without the first actually has probably led us to this place where we've seen so many significant ministries, incredibly skillful in hands, come crashing down.
Yeah, so true. Looking back, Don, you've had these God conversations, you've walked them out, you've seen them manifest. To sum up, what have you learnt about God in that journey?
Oh, wow. I think just the incredible love that he has for his church and the willingness to confront the church. You know, it says in the book of Proverbs that if we don't discipline our children, we hate them. And if we really love them, we'll shape them. And I think for a lot of us parents, you know, we always say, oh, discipline is so hard and I love them so much, I just can't bring myself to cross them. And I think the love of God is so faithful, so passionate, that he's willing for us to misunderstand him, to be angry with him, to, you know, he's secure enough to take us through his disciplines. You know, it says in Hebrews, doesn't it? If you're not being disciplined, you're not a child. You're not his child. Because we are his children, he loves us enough to be really, really faithful in disciplining us. And it's not always discipline either, Tanya. You know, sometimes it's absolutely passionate, joyful, walking the walk. And you'd never have it any other way. It's just that when we portray the life as that's all it is, that's not truthful. You know, you only have to read the Psalms to know. Yeah, you only have to read the Psalms to see it's up, down, lament, rejoicing. And over the 30 years, we've had all of that. And I'm awed, Tanya, at the unbelievable, passionate love of God for his people and for his church.
I love that. Truth-telling is inspired by love. It's not a thing to be feared. It's a thing to be welcomed. And I think as leaders, we have to be constantly willing to allow God to shine the spotlight on our hearts and expose and warn. It is a gift, isn't it? Because it leads us into freedom. Don, I've just been so blessed by getting to know you and your church and seeing the fruit of that pathway of integrity. And in these times, I just think your story, your example is such a help to people around. I did read your book. In fact, I remember reading the book Water Under the Bridge and going, oh, that explains a lot. So perhaps someone might be interested in getting a hold of that book. Where would they find it, Don?
It's on Amazon, Tanya, or they could contact us if they prefer hard copy. They could contact us just at Gateway Church, Hamilton, New Zealand, and we'd be happy to send them a copy, Tanya.
Beautiful. Well, thank you again, Don, for your time and your wisdom, but mostly for the walk that you've walked. And if God has trusted you to be able to carry that, well, then I know that we can also learn from your example. So bless you heaps, and thanks again for coming on.
Thanks, Tanya. Thanks. And we've so appreciated God Conversation. We loved having you in Hamilton. Look forward to having you back again. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to God Conversations with Tanya Harris. Don't miss the next episode by subscribing to the show on your favourite podcast app. And remember, the Holy Spirit was given so we could all hear God's voice. It was never meant to be a one-way conversation.